Ground Zero in New York, once again the site for remembrance, now 7 years on from those terrible attacks of 9/11. Hello and welcome. The fingerprints of that day in 2001 are visible on everything from law enforcement and air travel to immigration regulations and money transfers. One of the raging debates in America has been how to balance national security with civil rights and respect for international law in a time of fear. America responded to the 9/11 attacks by launching the so-called global war on terrorism, which began with the invasion of Afghanistan to oust the Taliban, who'd given al-Qaeda shelter. In the name of national security, the Bush administration has executed policies of preventative detention, coercive interrogation, registration of Arab and Muslim men, and supposedly a preventative war in Iraq. Another controversial result of the attacks was the USA Patriot Act, which allows the government to search phone and email communications, eases restrictions on intelligence gathering, cracks down on financial transactions and charity groups, and makes it easier for authorities to detain and deport immigrants. Well, the question on this 7th anniversary of 9/11 is, has America gone too far by turning into a nation that tortures suspects, spies on its citizens without warrants, and dismisses the value of the Geneva Conventions? And can America fight its enemies while maintaining civil rights and respect for international law? You can join the conversation. Well, joining me from London is David Cole, one of the country's leading constitutional scholars, who co-wrote Less Safe, Less Free: Why America is Losing the War on Terror. It argues that the Bush administration's approach to security has compromised America's values and made it more vulnerable to future attacks. His latest book is Justice at War: The Men and Ideas That Shaped America's War on Terror. And here in Washington, D.C. is Professor of International Law and Diplomacy, Ruth Wedgwood, who teaches at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Wedgwood has served as an advisor to the Department of Defense on the issue of military tribunals and as a member of the Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on International Law. I welcome you both to the show.
Thank you.
Professor Wedgwood, if I could start with you. There are a lot of people in the current U.S. administration who say that the policies that were enacted post 9/11 are essentially responsible for there being no further attacks against the U.S. Now, is it really the case that you can say that what's been enacted post 9/11 really has kept America safe?
You'd have to be a social scientist to actually figure out causality. I mean, I think one of the larger views is that by keeping the Taliban and al-Qaeda on the run, that's helped to just make it a bit more difficult for them to regroup. I think also strangely, although there's certainly been lots of controversy over the war in Iraq, that in the Muslim world, as I take it, the brutality of al-Qaeda in killing Sunni and Shia alike and indiscriminately in Baghdad and elsewhere has been something that really diminished any bravado that people might otherwise have felt for their violent adventures.
What about lessons learned? What do you think is the single biggest lesson, the single most important lesson that the USA has learned since 9/11?
Well, I think, and that David will say this certainly, you have to be careful not to go too far. The humane treatment of prisoners is something that's required by natural law, if not positive law, if not the Geneva Conventions. At the same time, I do think that leading up to the attacks during the 90s and under Bill Clinton and the beginning of the Bush administration, there had been a nonchalance about following al-Qaeda. There had not been any real successful effort to integrate the information collected in criminal justice settings and in intelligence settings so that the FBI would follow al-Qaeda onshore, CIA offshore, but not marry up the two sources of information. So too on how to try cases. Even now, and I just wrote a piece about this complaining in Forbes, there has not really been any meeting in the middle of how to try cases. Mary Jo White, who was the U.S. attorney in New York, a wonderful trial lawyer, who was the magisterial docent of the trials of the 1993 World Trade Center and also the 1998 bombings in Tanzania and Kenya that killed hundreds of people, mostly Muslims, and wounded thousands. She has concluded that really, with her experience about the difficulties of discovery, of disclosing ongoing intelligence activities in a trial, that you probably can't try many of these cases in criminal court.
Well, let's bring in Professor David Cole here and ask you, so thank you for joining us first, and thank you, and ask you, in your opinion, to what extent do you feel civil liberties have been eroded in the interest of national security?
Well, I think they've been eroded across the board, but particularly and selectively against Arabs and Muslims and against foreign nationals. And time and again, we've seen the Bush administration argue that they can do things to certain people because they're not Americans, essentially saying to the American public, you don't have to sacrifice your liberty for security because we'll sacrifice somebody else's liberty for your security, and the somebody else is virtually always an Arab and Muslim foreign national. So the government's argument with respect to the people at Guantanamo was they're not entitled to any rights because they're foreigners and they're outside of our borders. I represent Maher Arar, a Canadian citizen who was returning home to Canada when he was changing planes at JFK, and the United States stopped him, locked him up for 2 weeks, and then ordered him deported on the basis of secret evidence, and sent him not to Canada, his home, but to Syria, where he was tortured while being asked a set of questions virtually identical to those that the U.S. Officials were asking him at JFK Airport. And when we sued to challenge that, to say you can't take a human being and send him to another country for the purpose of having him tortured, the government said, even assuming that everything you say is true, no rights of Mr. Arar's were violated because he's not an American, because he's a Canadian. So I think we've seen a sort of broad brush sort of overturning of civil rights and civil liberties, but targeted particularly, and in the most extreme forms, targeted against foreign nationals with the argument that they don't deserve the same rights that Americans do.
Professor Cole, an email that came in, if I may put to you, came from Jay Morris here in the USA. They wrote in and saying, I have no objections to anything they are doing to keep us safe and defeat terrorism. Can you name any country that has more civil rights than America? Now, is that still the case? Is America still the land of the free?
Well, it's the land of the free, and it's also the world leader in per capita incarceration. So it's a land of contradictions, is what it is. And no, I don't. I think we are a country that is proud of its history in terms of protecting civil liberties and recognizing the importance of the rule of law, and exporting that and seeking to encourage other countries to do the same. But unfortunately, since 9/11, we've forgotten those lessons in a very significant way, such that we have acted far worse than many other countries around the world in terms of our responses to terror. I mean, you don't see Britain, which was also where I am today, which has also been the subject of terrorist attacks and Al-Qaeda plots. You don't see them rendering people to other countries to be tortured. You don't see them disappearing suspects into secret black sites around the world. You don't see them authorizing waterboarding and the like. So I think America has fallen down on its principles, and my hope is that at some point there will be a broad recognition of that, and we will be able to recover our standing in the world.
I'll get Professor Wedgwood to respond in a moment, but let's get Ali on the line from London. Ali, thanks for your patience. Go ahead with your question, please.
I think my question is basically, I think it's a general common question which sort of quite a lot of people from the part of the world that I came from now try to raise. What does America stand for in the current world, and what is the current foreign policy of Bush and his team? What do they do they represent America? If they do so, then Americans are doomed, in my opinion. It's nothing that I ever heard of America.
Okay. Let me put that to Professor Wedgwood. Actually, it's an interesting point. What Ali is saying is, what do you feel? What he's asking us, what does America represent now? I mean, for example, does the Bush administration represent when it comes to American values?
Well, I think the core values have been so deeply seated for 2 centuries, whether it's the heritage of the British Civil War and the Bill of Rights, that certainly the professed ideology, the professed philosophy is stable. It's not a erratically oscillating kind of political culture. I mean, I certainly agree with David. There's no excuse for torture. There's no excuse for physical abuse. It's interesting to see how countries around the world try to cope with terrorism. One of the reasons, and perhaps here David and I disagree, for allowing broader-based technical collection of information is that it avoids then the circumstances that create the human temptation of abuse. I've recently looked at what France does. in some ways it's more liberal, some ways less. They have a system with a juge d'instruction, a judge of examination, who can hold someone on a predicate of suspicion, of grave and profound suspicion, which almost can't be translated into Anglo-Saxon probabilistic terms of the common law, for up to now 4 years, 8 months. It used to be 10 years, without really having a lawyer present at all times when you're questioned. So there are systems that have been used by other countries that may pose other problems. But I take the problem of torture to be one that's ubiquitous in the world. And one reason to avoid it is that many, many countries use it for the most routine police investigations. Algeria has had problems with significant numbers of disappearances. The UN rendered a report on Algeria decrying the disappearances. It was ironic, although unrelated, that 3 or 4 weeks later there was another bombing. The UN headquarters were blown up. I mean, I think that the moral anguish of the present situation is that blowing up people with a bomb is torture. So when you think about responsibility to protect, it's not easy to say that passivity is by itself the right attitude.
Well, let's get from the UK as well. We've got on the line Zed. Go ahead, please.
Hi,
Hi.
Good evening. My comments are that since 9/11, I'm a Pashtun Afghan, and I'm a Muslim. But since 9/11, if I have been traveling on the airline, when I see a colored person in the airline, in the airplane, I get scared, more scared than and I have been open and letting the people, or the security people, to search me for anything, and so everybody can be searched.
Zed, I'm going to put this to Professor Cole in London. Professor, this is one of the issues that what Zed is raising is this issue of stereotyping now, and it seems to have changed the psyche of people, that if they see someone who's of a particular colour, ethnicity or look, that there's a natural tendency to believe that they are predisposed to being a terrorist or being, committing some sort of act. I wonder to what degree that has become entrenched in society, and perhaps what needs to be done to try and get round that stereotyping.
Well, it's definitely become entrenched, and I think the Bush administration is responsible in part for that entrenchment. In the first 2 years after 9/11, they rounded up and locked up in preventive detention over 5,000 foreign nationals in the United States, virtually all of them Arab or Muslim, and in most instances without any basis for suspicion regarding terrorism other than the fact that they were Arab or Muslim. They called in 8,000 men for FBI interviews simply because they were from Arab and Muslim countries, and as you indicated at the outset of the show, they required all men from Arab and Muslim countries to come in for special registration, fingerprinting, photographing, interviews and the like. And so when the government does that, and it sends a message to the public that this is the problem, it's Arabs and Muslims that are the problem, rather than it's terrorists that are the problem, this is a particular form of terrorism that has used Muslim ideology, or a perverted form of Muslim ideology, to justify what it's doing. But it's not Muslims and Arabs that are the problem, it's these terrorists that are the problem, and they are of course a fraction, a tiny, tiny fraction of the Arabs and Muslims in the United States, and of course in the world at large. So it's the last thing I'll say is that it's proven totally a failure in terms of identifying actual terrorists. So not one of the 5,000 people that we locked up in preventive detention in the United States turned out to be a terrorist.
I'm going to get a quick call before we take a break. Gabriel in Italy, what's your question? Quickly.
Yes, sir. I'm saying that the mission was accomplished when Saddam Hussein was dethroned, and why is it that they're still there and hanging in there and taking the oil from the country, and also they're giving free medical to the people of Iraq, which is okay by me, but in the United States it's $850 for the ambulance to come to your house, and then it's $900 for a day in the hospital and everything, and then the ambulance is $1,000 a day.
Okay.
And they don't want to help us and everything in the United States, and because I work for a big company, and the United States is very generous to the other countries, and they don't want to help us.
All right, Gabriel, that's an interesting point. what I'm going to do is get to that, an answer to that when we get back from this break. We're going to pause right now. We'll be back with more in just a few moments. Stay tuned.